Elu stood in the choking red dust of the wagon trail and watched the riders from her own village turn their horses back toward the mountains. Wind howling. They did not look back. They did not raise a hand in farewell. They simply rode away, leaving her standing with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, tightly woven cedar basket resting at her feet. She was a daughter of a chief, a woman who had once sat at the council fires, and now she was a punishment, a cast-off, given away to a stranger in a valley she did not know. The dust settled slowly around her, coating the hem of her heavy trade-cloth dress, settling into the intricate beadwork along her moccasins. She did not weep. She had promised herself in the long, silent hours of the journey that she would not give her father the satisfaction of her tears. If this story of resilience and finding a home in the hardest of places already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. The ranch house before her was a weathered gray structure that looked as though it had been grown from the rocky soil rather than built upon it. It was a lonely place, set against the jagged teeth of the high country, where the wind never truly stopped blowing. The porch sagged under the weight of years and neglect. A solitary hound lifted its head from the dirt, let out a half-hearted thump of its tail, and went back to sleep. Elu picked up her cedar basket. The woven fibers were smooth against her palms, a tangible reminder of the life she had been stripped of. Her crime had been defiance. She had refused a marriage alliance that would have bound her people to a man she knew to be treacherous, speaking her mind too freely, too loudly in front of the elders. Her father, a man whose pride was as brittle as dry winter grass, had chosen to break her. He had handed her over to the white cattleman who leased the lower valley, stating it was restitution for a long-forgotten dispute over grazing land. It was a lie, of course. It was an exile. She walked toward the house. Her steps were measured, her spine straight. The cattleman, a man she knew only as Elias Thorne, emerged from the shadowed doorway before she reached the steps. He was a tall man, made taller by the heavy boots he wore, with shoulders that sloped under the invisible weight of too much solitary labor. His face was a landscape of deep lines and sun-baked leather, his eyes the gray of creek stones after a hard rain. He looked at her. He looked at the empty road behind her. He looked at the small basket in her hands. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a profound, weary confusion. Elias stopped at the edge of the porch, resting one hand against a wooden post that had been polished smooth by years of leaning. He wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He had expected a delivery of supplies from the tribal agency, perhaps a message regarding the winter lease. He had not expected a woman. He had certainly not expected the chief's daughter standing in his yard with the quiet, immovable dignity of a mountain pine. "They left you," Elias said. His voice was rough, like a saw catching on knotty wood. It was not a question. "They did," Elu replied. Her English was flawless, learned from the mission school she had attended in her youth, a fact that seemed to startle the cattleman even further. She did not elaborate. She did not explain her father's wrath or the humiliation she was meant to endure. She simply stood her ground, waiting for the man to dictate the terms of her new, enforced reality. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling a long, slow breath. The wind caught the brim of his hat, lifting it slightly. "Your father sent word he was settling the grazing dispute. Said he was sending something of great value to balance the scales." He looked at her, truly looked at her, his gray eyes sweeping over her proud posture and the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. "I thought he meant horses. I don't trade in people. I don't own people." "I am not property," Elu said, her voice quiet, but possessing an edge that cut through the whistling wind. "But I am here, and I cannot go back." "You can go anywhere you want," Elias said, gesturing vaguely toward the horizon. "I'll give you a horse. I'll give you provisions. You can ride to the agency or to the settlement up north." Elu looked at the horizon. She saw only the vast, unforgiving expanse of a territory that was rapidly changing, a place where an indigenous woman traveling alone was not a person, but prey. She had no money. She had no allies. Her father had ensured that her exile was absolute. To leave this porch was to walk into starvation or worse. She looked back at Elias Thorne. She saw the fraying cuffs of his shirt, the hollows of his cheeks, the heavy exhaustion that seemed to weigh down his very bones. She saw a man who was drowning in his own life. "I will stay," Elu said. "I am capable. I can work. I will earn my keep. and you will not have to worry about the debt my father claims to owe you." Elias frowned, a deep furrow appearing between his brows. He was a man accustomed to solitude, a man who had built walls around his life after the death of his wife 3 years prior. He did not want a stranger in his home. He did not want the complication of a chief's daughter under his roof. But he was also a man who possessed a quiet, unshakable sense of fairness. He could see the desperation hiding just beneath her ironclad composure. He could see that she was at the absolute end of her rope, even if she refused to let the rope fray. "This is a hard place," Elias said softly. "It breaks people who are born to it. It will break someone who doesn't want to be here." "I am not easily broken," Elu said. Elias stared at her for a long moment. Clear his throat. He looked at her unblinking dark eyes, reading the quiet resolve that burned there. 30 days, he said finally. "You stay 30 days. You work the house, you help with the chores. If you want to leave after that, I'll pay you wages for your time and give you a horse. If you want to stay, we'll talk." 30 days, Elu agreed. She stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned beneath her feet, a sound of protest and reluctant acceptance. She had crossed the threshold. She was an outsider in a strange land, a punishment meant to suffer, but she had secured a foothold. The interior of the house was exactly as she had anticipated. It was a monument to grief and neglect. The air was stale, smelling of old grease, wood smoke, and unwashed wool. Dust coated every surface like a fine grey snow. The kitchen, which should have been the warm heart of the home, was a chaotic mess of unwashed tin plates, cast iron skillets crusted with charred food, and scattered sacks of flour and beans. In the corner of the main room, sitting in a rocking chair that was entirely too large for her, was a child. The girl looked to be no more than 6 years old. She had Elias's pale coloring, her hair a tangle of dull blonde curls, her dress stained and too short for her growing limbs. She stared at Elu with large, solemn eyes that held an ancient, watchful silence. "This is Sarah," Elias said, stepping into the room behind Elu and removing his hat. He did not look at the child as he spoke, his gaze fixed somewhere on the dusty floorboards. "She doesn't speak, not since her mother passed." Elu looked at the child. She did not offer a wide, false smile. She did not rush forward to coo or coddle. She simply inclined her head, a gesture of profound respect between two silent souls. Sarah blinked, her grip tightening slightly on the wooden armrests of her chair, but she did not look away. "Where do I sleep?" Elu asked. Elias pointed toward a small door off the kitchen. "Pantry room. There's a cot. It's not much, but it's dry." Elu walked to the room. It was narrow, smelling strongly of dried onions and old leather, but it had a small window that looked out toward the mountains. She placed her cedar basket on the narrow cot. She took a deep breath, letting the stale air fill her lungs. She was alone. She was stripped of her title, her family, her people. But she was not defeated. She removed her heavy shawl, folded it neatly, and walked back into the kitchen. Her first act was not one of grand heroism. It was an act of profound, methodical competence. She found the water bucket, discovered it empty, and walked out to the pump in the yard. The wind whipped at her hair, pulling strands free from her tight braids, but she ignored it. She pumped the heavy iron handle, the rhythmic squeak echoing across the empty yard, until the bucket overflowed with cold, clear water. She carried it back inside, her movements economical, without a single wasted motion. She built a fire in the cast iron stove. She did not ask Elias where the wood was. She had seen the pile by the back door. She did not ask how the stove drafted. She observed the soot patterns and adjusted the flue herself. Within 30 minutes, water was boiling. Within an hour, every dish in the kitchen had been scrubbed clean, dried, and stacked with precise order. Elias watched her from the doorway of the main room. He stood perfectly still, a man unaccustomed to the sudden, purposeful energy that had invaded his stagnant home. He watched as she took a sack of flour, scooped out a measured amount, and began to work it with water, salt, and a pinch of baking powder she had found in a rusted tin. Her hands moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, turning the dough, pressing it, folding it. She did not stop working the dough. She did not look up to seek his approval. She was entirely self-contained, a force of nature operating within the confines of his ruined kitchen. When the midday meal was ready, it was simple but transformative. fresh, hot flatbread, a stew made from dried beef and beans that she had somehow coaxed into tenderness, and hot, bitter coffee. She set a plate before Elias at the rough-hewn table. She took a smaller plate to the rocking chair and knelt before the silent child. Elu held the plate out. Sarah looked at the food, then at Elu's face. The child's eyes were guarded, suspicious of this sudden change in her gray world. Elu did not push the plate closer. She simply held it, her breathing steady, her expression calm and open. After a long minute, Sarah reached out a small, grimy hand and took a piece of the warm bread. She took a bite. She closed her eyes. It was the first fresh bread she had eaten in 3 years. Elu stood and took her own plate to the far end of the table, sitting opposite Elias. They ate in silence. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was no longer a hostile one. It was the silence of a truce, of boundaries being drawn and assessed. "You cook well," Elias said finally, his voice low. He was looking at his empty plate as if it held a mystery he could not solve. "I do many things well, Mr. Thorne," Elu said. She kept her gaze level. "I will need lye soap, a proper scrubbing brush, and whatever fabric you have to mend the child's clothes. They are inadequate for the coming cold." Elias nodded slowly. He felt a strange shifting in his chest, a loosening of a knot he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. He had expected a burden. He had been given a partner in survival. "I'll fetch them from the storehouse," he said. The days began to blur into a rhythm of relentless, quiet labor. Elu rose before the sun, the cold air of the pantry biting at her skin. She would build the fire, haul the water, prepare the morning meal, and then begin the systematic dismantling of the chaos that had consumed the ranch house. She washed windows that had not seen sunlight in years. She scrubbed floors until the original grain of the wood shone through the accumulated grime. She took apart Elias's torn shirts and mended them with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She did not complain. She did not ask for rest. Not lazy, not beaten, just running on a kind of stubborn momentum that refused to acknowledge defeat. She was proving her worth, not to Elias, but to herself. She was establishing a domain, claiming space in a world that had tried to erase her. The men who worked the ranch, a small, ragged crew of 3 hands, noticed the change immediately. The first morning, Elu brought a basket of hot biscuits out to the corral. The men stopped their work and stared. Toby, a young man with a face full of freckles and a perpetual look of earnest confusion, was the first to approach. He pulled his hat from his head, crushing it against his chest. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his face turning a deep shade of red. "These smell mighty fine." Elu offered him the basket. "Eat," she commanded gently. "A man cannot work cattle on an empty stomach." Toby took a biscuit, bit into it, and let out a sound of pure reverence. "Lord Almighty," he whispered. Old Man Miller, a veteran hand whose joints popped like dry twigs when he walked, hobbled over and took one without a word. He chewed slowly, his faded blue eyes studying Elu with a quiet, calculating intelligence. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion, and turned back to the horses. It was an acceptance, small, but absolute. But not everyone was willing to accept the new order. Silas, a thick-necked man with a permanent scowl and a deep-seated hatred for anything he did not understand, hung back by the fence. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt, crossing his arms over his barrel chest. "I ain't eating nothing cooked by a savage," Silas announced, his voice loud enough to carry across the crisp morning air. "Boss must be losing his mind, letting one of them into the house. Next thing you know, we'll all be scalped in our beds." The corral went dead silent. Toby looked terrified. Miller just chewed his biscuit, watching. Elias had ridden out to the far pasture early and was not there to intervene. Elu did not flinch. She did not drop her gaze. She slowly lowered the basket to the top rail of the fence. She looked at Silas, her dark eyes entirely devoid of fear. She saw a small, frightened man hiding behind a wall of bluster and prejudice. "The food is here, Silas," Elu said, her voice carrying the clear, ringing authority of a woman who had once commanded warriors. "If you choose to go hungry because of your ignorance, that is your choice. But do not mistake my presence here for a threat to your scalp. If I wished to harm you, you would not have had the breath to speak those words." Silas's face mottled with rage. He took a step forward, his fists clenching. He was accustomed to intimidation, to breaking things that defied him. But as he looked into Ilu's eyes, he found no purchase. He found a wall of pure, unyielding competence and moral superiority. He saw a woman who knew exactly who she was, and who knew exactly how small he was. He stopped. He muttered a crude curse under his breath, turned on his heel, and stalked away toward the barn. Ilu picked up the basket. She offered another biscuit to Toby, who took it with a trembling hand. The crisis had passed. She had established her boundaries, not with violence, but with the unassailable power of her own dignity. When Elias returned that evening, he found the atmosphere in the bunkhouse subtly shifted. Toby was humming. Miller was whittling on the porch. Silas was sulking in the corner, quiet and subdued. Elias didn't ask what had happened. He walked into his house and found it warm, smelling of roasted meat and wild sage. He found his daughter, Sarah, sitting at the table, a piece of charcoal in her hand, drawing on a scrap of brown paper while Ilu watched her with quiet encouragement. Elias stopped in the doorway. He looked at the scene before him, feeling a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. It was the ache of a frozen limb beginning to thaw, the painful rush of blood returning to a deadened heart. He realized with a sense of profound shock that his house felt like a home for the first time in years. "She draws well," Elu said, looking up at Elias. She did not smile, but her eyes were soft. "She has a memory for details. She drew the mountains exactly as they look from the west pasture." Elias walked over and looked at the paper. It was a crude sketch, but the jagged lines of the peaks were undeniably accurate. He placed a heavy hand gently on Sarah's shoulder. The child did not flinch away. "Thank you," Elias said, looking at Elu. He meant it for the meal, for the clean floor, for the fire, and for the quiet peace she had somehow wrestled into existence. "It is my job," Elu replied, turning back to the stove. "It's more than a job," Elias said softly. He went to the wash basin, scrubbing the dirt from his hands. "Vance sent a rider today." Elu paused, the iron spoon hovering over the stew pot. She had heard the name Vance mentioned in hushed, worried tones by Toby and Miller. Judson Vance was the wealthy neighbor to the east, a man who owned the town, the bank, and most of the water rights in the valley. "What does he want?" Elu asked. Elias dried his hands on a towel, his shoulders slumped, the weariness returning to claim him. "He wants this land. He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years. Now he claims I owe him for water that drifted from his diverted creek into my lower pasture. Says it's a breach of the Valley Water Compact. He's got a judge in his pocket who's willing to sign a lien against my herd." "Is it true?" Elu asked. "Did you take his water?" "No," Elias said bitterly. "Water runs downhill. His dam leaked. I can't stop gravity. But the law around here is whatever Judson Vance says it is. If he puts a lien on the herd, I can't sell them at the autumn drive. If I can't sell, I can't pay the bank. I lose the ranch." Elu turned to face him. She saw the defeat in his eyes, the heavy resignation of a man who had fought too long and lost too much. She thought of her father, of the men who had banished her, of the powerful men who believed they could break the world to their will. "Show me the papers," Elu said. Elias blinked. "What?" "The water compact," Elu said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The original deeds. Show them to me." "Elu, they're legal documents," Elias said, shaking his head. "They're full of surveyor jargon and territorial law. It took me a week just to read through the boundaries. I was educated by the Jesuits in St. Louis before I returned to my people," Elu said, her voice perfectly level. "I read Latin, Mr. Thorne. I am quite certain I can navigate surveyor jargon. Show me the papers." Elias looked at her, stunned. He had assumed, like everyone else, that she was merely a victim of circumstance, a competent worker of domestic tasks. He had not realized the depth of the intellect that lay behind her quiet exterior. Without a word, he walked to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room, unlocked it, and pulled out a thick stack of yellowed parchment and stiff paper. He laid them on the table, pushing aside the dinner plates. For the next 3 hours, the house was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the rustle of paper. Elu read through the documents with intense, methodical focus. She traced the surveyor lines with her finger. She cross-referenced the dates of the water compact with the original territorial land grants. Elias sat across from her, watching her face in the flickering lamplight. He saw the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the way her mind worked like a precision instrument, sorting, analyzing, connecting. Music. Finally, Elu sat back. She tapped a long, slender finger against a paragraph buried deep within an addendum to the original 1860 land grant. "He is lying," Elu said. Elias leaned forward. "About the leak?" "About his right to the water entirely," Elu explained, her voice calm and authoritative. "Look here. This grant establishes the boundaries of Vance's property, but this addendum signed by the territorial governor 3 years later explicitly reserves the water rights of the High Creek for the indigenous tribes of this region in perpetuity as part of an older treaty. Vance doesn't own the water. He never did. He's been leasing the land around it, but the water itself belongs to the reservation." Elias stared at the paper, then at Elu. "But what does that mean for me?" "It means," Elu said, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of her mouth, "that Judson Vance has been illegally damming a federal waterway. If he tries to take you to court over a water dispute, you do not argue about the leak. You present this document to the federal marshal in the city, not his local judge. You accuse him of stealing federal resources. The moment a marshal looks at this, Vance's lien becomes extortion." Elias was speechless. He read the paragraph she had indicated. The legal language was dense, but she was right. It was clear as day. The water was protected. Vance had been bluffing for years, relying on the ignorance and exhaustion of his neighbors to steal what wasn't his. "How did you find this?" Elias whispered, looking at her with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. "I've read this a dozen times." "You read it looking for a way to defend yourself," Elu said. "I read it looking for a way to attack him. It is a different way of seeing the world." Elias looked at her. He looked at the proud tilt of her chin, the strength in her shoulders, the fierce, protective intelligence in her eyes. He realized then that his father-in-law's debt, the grazing dispute, the punishment her father had intended, it was all meaningless. She was not a punishment. She was a revelation. "You saved my ranch," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have not saved it yet," Elu corrected him. "Vance must be confronted. But now you have the weapon you need." The next morning, the 30-day mark arrived. It was the day Elu was supposedly free to leave. Elias did not mention it. Elu did not mention it. The unspoken agreement hung in the air, solid and real as the iron stove in the kitchen. She was not leaving. This was her ground now. 2 days later, Judson Vance arrived. He did not come alone. He rode into the yard with 3 armed men, a cloud of dust announcing their arrival. Vance was a large man, dressed in a fine broadcloth suit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the dusty valley. He possessed the arrogant swagger of a man who had never been told no. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He did not wear his gun. He held the stack of papers in his left hand. Elu stood just inside the doorway, her presence a quiet anchor in the shadows. Sarah peeked out from behind Elu's heavy skirt, clutching the fabric tightly. "Morning, Elias," Vance called out, not bothering to dismount. His horse danced nervously in the dirt. "I trust you got my message. I've brought the paperwork for the lien. You sign the herd over to me and we'll call the water debt settled. It's a generous offer. Saves you the humiliation of a public auction." Elias walked down the steps. He looked at the armed men, then at Vance. He felt no fear. For the first time in years, he felt a cold, clear certainty. He looked back at the doorway, catching Elu's eye. She gave a single, slow nod. "I won't be signing anything, Judson," Elias said, his voice carrying across the yard. Vance's smile tightened. "Now, Elias, let's not be foolish. Judge Higgins has already reviewed the complaint. The law is on my side." "The local law might be," Elias said, holding up the papers. "But federal law isn't. I've been doing some reading, specifically the 1863 addendum to your territorial grant, the one that explicitly states the High Creek water belongs to the reservation, not to you." Vance's face went perfectly still. The arrogant swagger vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp calculation. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Elias said, taking a step closer to the horse. "You've been illegally damming a federal waterway for 5 years. You don't own the water that leaked onto my land. You stole it. And if you try to file that lien, I'm taking this deed straight to the federal marshal in Denver. I imagine the fines for stealing government resources for 5 years will cost you a lot more than my herd." The silence in the yard was absolute. The armed men looked at each other, suddenly unsure of their position. They were hired to intimidate a broke rancher, not to tangle with federal marshals. Vance stared at Elias, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He looked past Elias toward the house and saw Elu standing in the doorway. He saw the proud, defiant posture of the indigenous woman, and he understood. He knew Elias Thorne was not a man to dig through old legal texts. He knew he had been outsmarted, not by the cattleman, but by the woman standing in his shadows. "This isn't over, Thorne," Vance spat, hauling hard on his horse's reins. "Yes, it is," Elias said firmly. "Get off my land, Judson, and take your dam down before the marshal does it for you." Vance glared at him for a long moment, the hatred burning in his eyes. But he was a coward at heart, a man who relied on rigged games. When the game was fair, he folded. He spurred his horse and rode hard out of the yard, his men trailing behind him in a cloud of defeated dust. Elias stood in the yard, watching them go. He let out a long, shuddering breath. The heavy weight that had rested on his shoulders for years seemed to lift, carried away by the autumn wind. He turned and walked back up the steps to the porch. Elu stepped out to meet him. She did not smile, but the tension had left her shoulders. "He will not return," Elu said quietly. "Men like that are afraid of the light. You shone a light on his theft." Elias looked at her. He looked at the woman who had been discarded by her people, handed over as a punishment, expected to break under the harshness of his life. Instead, she had taken the broken pieces of his existence and forged them into something strong, something resilient. She had fed his men, cared for his child, and saved his home. "I didn't shine the light, Elu," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did." He reached out and for the first time took her hands in his. Her hands were rough from labor, strong and capable. He held them gently, a gesture of profound respect and deep, quiet affection. "The 30 days are up," Elias said, his gray eyes searching hers. "You are free to go. I will give you whatever you ask: money, horses, an escort to the city." Elu looked down at his hands holding hers. She felt the warmth of his skin, the steady strength of his grip. She looked past him, to the rugged, beautiful mountains that boxed in the valley. She looked at the porch, where Sarah was now sitting, watching them with a small, hesitant smile. She had lost a home. She had been exiled from her past. But here, in this harsh, unforgiving place, she had built something new. She had proven her worth, not through bloodline or marriage alliances, but through her own undeniable competence and character. She had found a man who did not see her as a punishment or a prize, but as an equal. "I have no wish to go to the city, Elias," Elu said, her voice soft but entirely certain. "I have work to do here. The winter is coming, the child needs a new coat, and Silas still needs to learn how to speak with respect." Elias let out a breath that sounded like a laugh, a rusty, beautiful sound. "Silas might be a lost cause, but the rest of it, we can manage." "We will manage," Elu corrected him. She gently pulled her hands from his, turning back toward the door. "Now come inside. The wind is cold, and the coffee is getting bitter." Elias watched her walk back into the house. He watched the way she moved, with purpose and grace, a woman who owned the ground she walked on. He followed her inside, closing the heavy wooden door against the cold wind, sealing the warmth within. The ranch in the high valley did not become an easy place. The winters were still brutal, the work was still backbreaking, and the world outside their fences was still changing in violent, unpredictable ways. But the house was no longer a monument to grief. It was a fortress of quiet strength. Elu never returned to her father's village. She did not need to. She had redefined herself. She was no longer the defiant daughter, the exile, the punishment. She was the heart of the ranch, the brilliant, capable partner of Elias Thorne, and the fiercely protective mother to a child who had learned to laugh again. Her father had intended to throw her away into the wilderness, hoping the harshness of the cattleman's life would crush her spirit. Instead, she took the wilderness, took the shattered cattleman, and built an empire of quiet dignity and enduring love. She had arrived with nothing but a cedar basket and her own unyielding spirit. What she found was a place to stand. What Elias Thorne got was not a punishment, nor a servant, nor a temporary solution to a lonely life. What he got was the woman who made it a home,